Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire with General Pervez Musharraf, a man of contradictions, a military dictator who twice imposed an emergency on his country, and yet someone who tolerated and accepted and even encouraged a free press and was happy with tough interviews. A moderate Muslim who, allegedly, according to the British press, enjoyed a glass of whisky, but also someone who boasted that he was the strongest supporter of the militant Lashkar-e-Toiba, an army chief who was the architect of Kargil, and then a president who perhaps did more than any other to try and find a solution to the Kashmir issue. So how should we remember General Musharraf? Joining me live from Lahore is the editor-in-chief of the Friday Times and the former caretaker chief minister of Pakistan's Punjab province, Najam Sethi. Mr. Sethi, General Musharraf ruled Pakistan for nearly 9 years from 1999 to 2008, first as chief executive and then as president. It was a bloodless coup that brought him to power after the high drama of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif trying to prevent Musharraf, who was army chief at the time, returning to Pakistan from Sri Lanka. Was the coup welcome, and was Musharraf popular in the early years?
Thank you, Karan. So let's get cracking on the first question. Yes, I think by the time Musharraf took over, Nawaz Sharif was not terribly popular, especially with the media. He'd cracked down on it. And so there was a sigh of relief in some senses when the army took over under Musharraf. And also, following that, Musharraf made a very grand opening statement of reform, which went down very well with a lot of Pakistanis, liberals especially, because he was thought to be a liberal and not an Islamicist also. So yes, it began on a fairly auspicious note at home, but abroad, hardly anybody knew Musharraf. In fact, the Americans, the Indians and others knew that he'd been responsible for, Kargil. And so therefore, that's the sort of the problem we faced.
Now, 2 years after General Musharraf took over, 2001 happened, and Musharraf fairly quickly aligned Pakistan very closely with George Bush's America. It wasn't a popular decision with everyone in Pakistan, but was it both inevitable and, in the circumstances, the right decision?
Well, it turns out it wasn't the right decision, but I suppose the thing about Musharraf was he was a pragmatist. And he would try and get his way, and when he found he couldn't, he would immediately backtrack and try and find other solutions. This is exactly what happened after 9/11, when the Americans threatened to bomb Pakistan and Afghanistan into the Stone Ages if we didn't agree. If you're not with us, you're against us. That philosophy was given to Musharraf. And he immediately succumbed to it and said, fine, we are with you. There's no question of not being with you. But over the next 20, 15 years, Pakistan's policy regarding Afghanistan, whose basis was laid by Musharraf, was a bit of a double game. On the one hand, we gave sanctuary to the Taliban, which had fled from Afghanistan under American bombing in Pakistan. And on the other hand, we were siding with America to stop the Taliban from destabilizing the new Afghan government. And so right at the end of it, You have Donald Trump, first Mike McCullen, then George Bush, and then Donald Trump basically saying that the Pakistanis began to play us under General Musharraf. So, Musharraf's argument was this is in our best interests. We can't afford to antagonize a superpower, but we can't afford to let Afghanistan go down out of our range of interests.
Two quick questions on that. Was Musharraf bullied into supporting America by that threat? You're either with us or you're against us, and we will bomb you to the Stone Age if you don't support us. And secondly, he has a reputation for both hunting with the hounds and running with the hares. Did he get credit for what looks like duplicity in Pakistan, or did people say he's not even honest to his allies? Which of the two?
I think Pakistanis tend to see such matters in terms of their own self-interest. And, the narrative that was spun by Musharraf and the security establishment ended up justifying this sort of policy. Because there was a lot of anti-Americanism, and there still is in Pakistan. So, in a sense, the idea was that, okay, if the Americans are giving us a lot of money, which, by the way, sustained Musharraf during all those difficult years, at least $20 billion came our way. And that was a lot of money in those times. And the economy was tottering. So, yes, I think the army got new weapons. The economy got a new injection of assistance. And so everything was hunky-dory. So there was this game playing. On the one hand, we were giving sanctuaries to the Taliban and protecting their leaders in Pakistan. On the other hand, we were telling the Americans that, go ahead, we're with you. So yes, I think Pakistanis generally felt that that was the right policy. Although by and large, it now turns out that policy really ended up blowing up in our face. First by alienating the Americans in due course, and now we are having to face the backlash of those policies of supporting the Taliban, because now we are having, we have terrorism sponsored from across the border into Pakistan. And I'm not talking about India, I'm talking about Afghanistan.
Now, for several of the years that Musharraf was the ruler of your country, your economy grew at 6%, something it hasn't achieved for many years thereafter. But was that because of his economic policies, or was it because of the fortuitous beneficence of American aid?
I mean, in my view, it was totally because of American foreign aid to Pakistan. And as you know, the minute that aid dried up, after 2000 and 2018, 19, as soon as America left Afghanistan, we are in trouble because we don't have enough money to pay our imports. So we've been entirely dependent on this sort of assistance that was coming directly and indirectly via the American-sponsored or controlled aid agencies, or whether directly in the form of coalition support, as it was called then.
Now, Musharraf was a military dictator, even though he sought to legitimize his rule with an election of sorts in 2002 and a confidence vote in 2004. What was the state of individual rights, and in particular, what was the state of press freedoms under his rule? Am I right in saying that it was under his rule that the electronic media proliferated in Pakistan, creating channels that now even today's governments find very difficult to control?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Earlier prime ministers, including Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif, had not really freed the media. They'd put a lid on the number of channels that could operate. As soon as Musharraf came in, he realized that the media had been anti-Benazir and anti-Nawaz Sharif. And this was the best way to woo them. So he opened up the airspaces. And it was an incredible opening. And we've never looked back since then. There have been hiccups during Imran Khan's time. And of course, in the last months of Musharraf, when he was in trouble in Pakistan in 2007, 2008, he clamped down on various channels, including the top channels. He shut them down. That very freedom that he gave both to the social media and to the electronic media actually ended up being a knife in his back, in a sense, because then there was, everybody was open to criticize, and that's what they did when he made mistakes. He wasn't spared.
But this is one of the interesting contradictions of Musharraf. He was a military dictator, but he permitted and encouraged a free press, and in particular the electronic media. And more importantly, from an Indian point of view, he gave many interviews to Indian journalists, including me, which were pretty tough interviews, but it didn't put him off, and it never held him against them, because he'd repeatedly give interviews again and again. That was an interesting contradiction in a dictator, wasn't it?
Yes, well, he was very unlike a dictator in many ways. I knew him personally. The Friday Times was the very first paper to interview him 15 days after he took over. And after that, both Jugnu, my wife, and I uh, became friends, shall we say. Not close friends, but friends. And we had enormous interactions with him across those years. So we got to know him very well. And indeed, we ran a funny column on the back page of our paper. It was called Mush and Bush, where we took the Mickey out of both Mush and Bush. And he would laugh at it and never asked us to stop publishing that column. There were occasions when he took umbrage at some what I had written, but then a meeting or two later he would back off and say, no, no, that's okay, it's okay, I don't mind. Yes, I think there was a contradiction, but that sort of contradiction you will find in Musharraf's policies throughout those 8, 9 years that he ruled Pakistan. As you say, I mean, it was not just the media; it was about politics, it was about economic policy, it was about India policy, many such things.
But the interesting thing is he was a dictator with a sense of humor. That's not a quality you associate with, say, Pinochet.
He had not only a sense of humor, he was very candid. Often we journalists would be shocked uh, to hear him say things that we thought they would never say on record. And I rarely found him to lie outrightly. He had difficulty in lying with a straight face. And if you confronted him a little bit more, he would try and give you an idea that, well, this is the way it is. So it was always great to interview him. He was very candid. And I think that is one of the reasons why after he left Pakistan, he went on this world tour of lectures where he was very candid about a lot of things. Many things that would come under the Official Secrets Act. He was very candid about them and he talked about them openly, which was fantastic from the media's point of view.
There's a wonderful story in today's Business Standard in New Delhi where apparently it said that the Business Standard correspondent tongue in cheek complimented General Musharraf after he had won the 2002 presidential election with a 98% majority, which is unheard of in any democracy. And apparently he turned around and said to the correspondent, if you're being sarcastic, I have nothing to say. But if you're sincere, I thank you, which I think was a very artful way of handling an awkward, difficult moment.
Yes, there were many such moments. I remember having arguments with him on many issues. I remember him getting angry with me. And then I remember him cooling down and saying, if he'd invited me for tea, he'd say, stay on for lunch, and that sort of thing. And we had a number of interactions with his wife and his mother. I think his mother's influence was paramount. She was a very cultured lady, educated, highly educated and cultured lady. And I think that rubbed off on Musharraf. He was never impolite. He was never, as you say, very angry, and he would never hold his anger for long. He would always be ready to hear the other person's point of view, even though he may or may not agree with you. So yes, it was always great talking to him.
Now, in 2007, he abruptly dismissed the Chief Justice of Pakistan, thus provoking the massive lawyers' protest, culminating in the second emergency that he had to declare in November of that year. Looking back, or maybe even contemporaneously at that time, was that one of his biggest mistakes?
Yes, I think so. It's the one that brought him down. We had a free media. There'd been great support for Iftikhar Chaudhry, and then all of a sudden, Musharraf took this press. And the details that came out of the way Iftikhar Chaudhry was sacked, shall we say, were quite horrific in the sense it was quite autocratic and arrogant the way the Chief Justice of Pakistan was dealt with. In the past, when Chief Justices have been told frankly where they stand by dictators, there's never been any leakage about what was said and what was not said and who reacted in what fashion. In this case, the Chief Justice came home and immediately let it be known in terms of what had happened. And that led to a great wave of sympathy for him and angst against Musharraf, which of course led to the lawyers' movement and then thereby hangs another tale.
So Musharraf met his match in Iftikhar Chaudhry. Iftikhar Chaudhry outplayed him by ensuring that the rather abominable way he was sacked was made public and engineered a sympathy wave for him.
I'm not sure whether it was a thought out strategy or not. I think Iftikhar Chaudhry was that sort of a man, blunt and straightforward, and not afraid. So I think he reacted in a very personal sort of way. If he'd been handled in a different way, he might not have reacted the way he did. But apparently, the way the meeting went in the room with Musharraf and General Kiani, at that time, the then DGISI, Musharraf basically told him, "You're sacked," and walked out. And Iftikhar Chaudhry was shocked, and then Kiani tried to calm him down. But at the end of the day, he was told to go home, and he just felt that this was unacceptable. And when he went home, because they realized that this is a maverick Chief Justice who might actually turn around and say things, they literally sort of put him under house arrest of sorts. Not formally, but that was the impression. And I think he revolted. And there was a lawyers' movement waiting in the wings, civil society and the lawyers, because our Pakistan has had these three bouts of martial law, none of which lasts longer than a decade, and then each one of them tries to open up space for politics, and the minute they do, it rebounds on them, and so that's exactly what happened this time.
In fact, events thereafter led precipitously to Musharraf's resignation in August 2008. If he was popular when he first came to power, was he a disgraced man by the time he was effectively eased out?
Yes, he'd taken on the judiciary and lost that round. He'd held fair elections, but Benazir had been assassinated on the eve of those elections, and the informed speculation was that although the Taliban may have done it, that there was a contract put on her, and Musharraf did nothing to stop it. In fact, some people say may have facilitated something like that, because Benazir had made promises to him which he backtracked on, and Musharraf was very angry. She had apparently said to him that I will not come back before the elections, and then she broke her pledge and returned. And then that enabled Nawaz Sharif to come back. And all of a sudden, the game was out of Musharraf's hands, and he had to live with it. And I think Benazir made this allegation that she'd sought security from Musharraf and he declined it. So she ended up having to make her own security arrangements, which clearly weren't adequate enough. And then everything that happened after her assassination led to the conclusion amongst many minds in Pakistan, including foreign observers who investigated it, that the very least that could be said about it was that the government had turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to her pleas for security, and that in some way or the other, they was complicit in what happened. So that was one of the reasons.
You've certainly raised a whole series of issues that suggest that there were serious questions that Musharraf had to answer about his alleged role, his alleged complicity in Benazir Bhutto's assassination. Similar concerns also were raised in your country about the killing of Nawab Akbar Bukti. Once again, were there questions that Musharraf was required to answer and never did?
Yes, he was required to answer those questions, certainly in private conversations. I was part of a private conversation also in which this issue was raised. And he shrugged it off. He'd actually made an earlier statement that was made public, basically saying that you can't hide Bukti. I'm going to come and get you. That sort of thing, which ended up confirming the fact that perhaps there might have been a way of negotiations. But Akbar Bukti was intransigent. He had gone and holed out in a cave with a few of his followers. He was no threat to anybody. And the government then sent in the army to flush him out. And they basically knocked him out.
He was effectively bombed out of his cave, wasn't he, by the Pakistan Air Force?
No, not by the Air Force. I think local troops did whatever they had to do.
But the finger pointed at General Musharraf's role in this.
Yes, because if they'd just sat there and done nothing, 10 or 15 or 20 days down the line, there would have been a surrender of sorts. Or Akbar might have done something himself. But at the end of the day, there was a confrontation and he was taken out.
Now, during the last few years of General Musharraf's life, he seemed to be locked in a permanent, if not ceaseless, battle with Pakistan's courts. In 2019, he was given the death sentence for high treason, although that was subsequently revoked. In his last years, was he in some sense a fugitive from justice, or at least a man running scared of the courts?
Yes, he was a fugitive from justice, which is why he was in exile. In 2012, I think he made an attempt to come back. He thought he might be popular, and he had floated his own political party. But then when he came back for a short while, he realized that that was false consciousness, and it was all over for him. By that time, of course, cases had been registered against him. And then he had difficulty getting out of Pakistan, and he did so with the help of the then Army Chief General Rahil Sharif, who went to Nawaz Sharif and pleaded that Musharraf be let go. But of course, then the law had to take its course, and the courts had to get involved, and the courts then gave him the opportunity to go. And the Prime Minister of Pakistan at that time didn't stand in his way. That says a lot about Nawaz Sharif. He could have made life much more difficult for Musharraf, but he let him go. He said, okay, fine, let's forget the past. Musharraf had not been kind to Nawaz Sharif, as you know.
But you're making a very important point that towards the end, to be able to get away from Pakistan and escape justice, he had to plead to one of his successors as Army Chief, General Rahil Sharif, to say, help me out.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I know it for a fact that Rahil Sharif went to Nawaz Sharif and said, please let him go. And Nawaz Sharif said, okay, if you say so.
Let's at this point, Najam Sethi, come to the relationship with India under the Musharraf years. Kargil happened when he was army chief. Was he the architect of that terrible mistake? Is Nawaz Sharif right in claiming that Musharraf kept him almost completely in the dark?
The Kargil project is an old project. The file kept being dusted out from time to time. And Benazir, especially during her time, said, no, this is not on. When Nawaz Sharif became prime minister, I think he was given this story of how this is something that can be done, and it will avenge the Siachen loss and also create difficulties for India. And I think he was given a rosy picture of how Kashmir could be liberated, and this would be a feather in his cap. I think Nawaz Sharif was not given the full details. He was told that the Kashmiris, Mujahideen, would rise, and there would be some facilitation, but we would not be directly involved. Don't forget that this is the sort of argument that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had given General Ayub Khan in 1965, where he said when the proposal was that the Kashmiris would rise with some help from Pakistan, but that there would be no direct interventions. And in the end, it turned out that that was not the case even in 1965. And this was again the same sort of line was pushed. And Nawaz Sharif bought it. I think he was not strong enough to, didn't have a sense of how things might pan out. So he went along with it. He was not fully in the picture. I think he was fully in the picture in May, when by that time the Indians had also found out what was going on, that these weren't Kashmiris, these are Pakistani regulars in Mujahideen uniforms. And by the time India found out, I think Nawaz Sharif also realized that he'd been played. And Musharraf then admitted as much to him. And then, of course, Nawaz Sharif's wrath rose when he felt not only that he hadn't been taken into confidence fully. Don't forget, even the army and even the Navy chief and the Air Force chief weren't taken into confidence. This was one of their complaints, that this Kargil operation was kept secret from them too, until they found out later in May. Because the Kargil operation basically started late in the earlier year when the infiltrations began. And they carried on for many months, slowly, surreptitiously, until they were able to achieve those heights in winter and then hang in there. So I think Nawaz Sharif felt very angry and abused, in a sense, when he was compelled to go to the United States to meet with President Clinton and ask him to intervene with the Indian government and with Mr. Vajpayee. Nawaz and Mr. Vajpayee had very good relations, and Nawaz felt betrayed that his relationship with Vajpayee had been soured in this fashion. And so therefore, when the retreat began, which is what the Indians demanded and the Americans demanded, and Nawaz conceded, and when the retreat began, the Indians refused to have a ceasefire. So the Pakistani army regulars who were retreating from Kargil under the understanding or agreement lost many soldiers during the retreat because there was no cover from our side, and the Indians refused to hold their fire. So yes, that went down very badly in the army itself. And eventually, we now learn that there was some rethinking in the army too, following that particular debacle. But the fact is that there was not just Musharraf who was involved. There were two other senior army commanders who were part of this strategy. One was General Aziz, who was then the chief of staff, and the other was General Mahmood, who was then the DG-ISI. These three were the ones who had formulated this whole strategy. And the other two actually carried out the coup when Musharraf was not even in Pakistan. And when Musharraf landed in Pakistan, he wasn't sure whether the coup was going to be pro-Musharraf or anti-Musharraf, and whether his people had carried out the coup or whether there was some other group that had done it. And it took him some time to be reassured that his people had taken over. So it was the other two who had actually convinced Musharraf to do the Kargil thing. And they were the two who eventually um, carried the blame for this. But Musharraf kept them on, but after a few years, he got rid of each one of them.
But you're saying two very important things there, which I'll just repeat for the sake of an Indian audience. One, that the belief that Nawaz Sharif was almost completely in the dark during the critical preparatory stages is not true. He was informed but misled. He was partly informed, he was partly aware, but he was misled, just as Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 65 had misled Ayub Khan into believing the outcome would be something else. And the other important thing you said is that even within the Pakistan army, there was disquiet about the debacle that Kargil ended in. But that debacle, it seems, was held against Nawaz Sharif, not held against Musharraf, because Musharraf ended up dictator of the country.
Yes, but I will just edit that conclusion by saying that the Kargil operation, in effect, started in October of the earlier year. And Nawaz Sharif was not in the loop. I think they brought Nawaz Sharif in the loop after they had scaled the heights and they were in control. That's when they brought Nawaz Sharif in the loop. So I think by and large, Nawaz was innocent of the conspiracy that was being hatched in army headquarters by these three critical people. So by the time Nawaz found out about it, or by the time they briefed him, which I think was sometime in February, March of the next year, he was told that this is Kashmiris and we are going to be facilitating them, and this is going to be a big feather in your cap. I don't think he was taken into confidence at that level. That
But
is
you
why
see,
he was so angry when he found out later that
can I interrupt? If
they
he was
kept it
briefed
from him.
around February, March of 1999, that's roughly around the time Vajpayee made his historic visit by bus to Lahore. So the briefing of
Well,
Kargil happened roughly around that time.
no, in fact, it happened after that. What happened was that when Mr. Vajpayee and Nawaz Sharif embarked on the bus diplomacy, Musharraf had already knew that he'd already embarked on a project, and there was no way the army was going to support this new rapprochement that Nawaz Sharif was building. So the strategy was already in place. Nawaz was not on board. That's why Nawaz went ahead with the bus diplomacy, and it's after its own. Nawaz, I think, must have had his first inclination that something was amiss when Musharraf refused to be part of the lineup to receive the Indian Prime Minister, and subsequently also created obstacles. It's in March after Vajpayee left and after that great bonhomie that was established that Musharraf finally thought it necessary to bring Nawaz Sharif in the loop.
Now, the amazing thing is after Kargil, when Musharraf was the ruler of the country, India-Pakistan relations enjoyed one of their warmest spells. I know there was the setback of Agra, but then there was considerable progress on the back channel over Kashmir. Not just Khurshid Kusuri, who was Musharraf's foreign minister, but many in India also believe that the two countries came closer than ever before to a solution of the Kashmir crisis. First of all, do you agree with that view that Musharraf came closest to a solution than anyone else in Pakistan? And secondly, how much of the credit goes to Musharraf?
Well, I'll tell you something. I think Musharraf's mind was changed on the how to approach India by the assassination attempts that took place, and it was the jihadis that were carrying out these assassination attempts, and because they felt that Musharraf had given over to the Americans, and they felt that he was now an American agent in Pakistan. I think that's what knocked him back, and he realized that this was an asset that the army may have used against India, but this was an asset that would be used against him for making some new developments or being pragmatic in some ways. And they were going to hold him hostage because I think that's when, in 2002, 2003, he realized this. And then he began to have a change of heart in terms of how it was necessary to move forward with India. If you remember, he had walked out of Agra because the Indians had at the last minute put together a press statement that he wasn't happy with. But this is the same gentleman, before he went to Agra, was determined not to give an inch to India. I remember a meeting with him, senior journalists, in which everybody said, you got to be firm, don't bargain away Kashmir, and so on and so forth. And he was determined. And I remember saying to him, but you have a problem here with the jihadis, and they were going to turn against you. And he got angry with me. In the midst of a big meeting, he got angry with me and walked out because I said, "These guys are going to turn against you. Have you thought about that?" And but so that's the sort of up and down I had with him. But then he opened up this extraordinary initiative with India, and I think he saw the need for it. But here's the point: it was an extraordinary initiative. If it had come to completion, I think life might have been very different for India and Pakistan, and for the Kashmiris. But after he left, then there were very senior voices in the Pakistani army that stood up and said we were never on board this initiative. This was Musharraf's decision. It was a bad decision. He should never have done this. But they didn't have the courage to oppose him. And one or two who did oppose him were shunted out of the army, senior generals. So this was not an initiative that he took with the approval of the army high command. This was Musharraf and maybe 2 or 3 other people. And the army chief is so powerful, he can do these things.
Can I ask you this? This is clearly, as you describe it, a turning point which sadly history lost out on. And you've also suggested that Musharraf himself was sincere. But is it the case that if he hadn't run into trouble with Iftikhar Chaudhry and his own regime began to unravel, that he might have been able to push this through? Because Kasuri writes in his book that the DG-ISI supported it. So did Musharraf, if he hadn't fallen, have the capacity to push this through? Or would it have been too much because of the opposition from the army that surfaced afterwards?
Musharraf was a risk taker. He also had an eye to history. I know that he thought that if he could pull it off, he would be remembered as a great hero, possibly even vie for a Nobel Prize along with Mr. Vajpayee. These are the sort of things that were going through his mind. And the notion that you could freeze Kashmir for 50 years while the two countries got on with it was a very radical one. It would make, but here's the interesting thing. He got into trouble. He still wanted to move forward with India during that last year when he was in trouble. But I think the Indians were a little skeptical about his ability to push it through, given the fact that he was now faced with many problems. And I also think he said to the Indians that, look, I'm facing a bit of a storm here right now. Maybe this is not the right time. Just hang in there. Let me get over this and we'll come back to the table. So I think on both sides, there was a freeze, as it were, on moving this process forward. If either one of them had insisted, I'm sure it would have gone forward. But Musharraf, I think, became cautious. He was under attack. Kashmir was also coming up, and so he sort of held back at that last minute. And so therefore the Indian government, I think it was Dr. Manmohan Singh's government at that time, they just sat back and said, okay, when you're ready, we'll be ready. And of course, it didn't work out like that.
We're coming to the end of this interview, and before I ask you a couple of questions about Musharraf the man and his character, let me ask you one final question about the ruler. What would be your assessment, your overall view of the Musharraf years?
Well, if he'd succeeded in doing 2 or 3 things, he would have been remembered with great affection. If he'd succeeded in resolving the India-Pakistan issue, and if he'd succeeded in letting the press and media and civil society flourish, he would have been remembered very fondly. But as it happens, that's not the case. He didn't succeed in either, and his legacy is a very mixed one. People right now, there are some people who are grieving for him formally. There are some people who are openly criticizing him, even though Muslim culture says that when somebody's passed away, you should not be overly critical. Some people are still critical. Don't forget that in these last years, the Peshawar High Court actually sentenced him to death. And the Chief Justice of the Peshawar High Court had very strong words, like literally like hang him, by the rope until his neck is broken and things like that. It was a very strong.
For 3 days, let his body be hanging.
Yes, I mean, so, there were strong sentiments and emotions in this country about him. So it's a mixed legacy. He will be remembered for some of the things he tried to do but failed. He tried to, he talked about enlightened moderation. In the end, he succumbed to conservatism. He talked about peace with India. In the end, he couldn't succeed. He talked about democracy. In the end, he became a dictator. He talked about press freedom. In the end, he ended up cracking down on them. So yes, I think, and then he had a free election, even though it was a difficult time, he held a free election. It brought the People's Party to power, and the People's Party then turned around and moved the vote of impeachment against him. because, of course, memories were livid and vivid at that time, because Benazir had just been assassinated, and the fingerprints of the state apparatus were all over the place.
What about, and this is coming to the end of the interview now, Musharraf the man? Would I be right in saying he was a modern man, a moderate, not a fundamentalist Muslim, but also a man with both charm and a certain sartorial style? He was a snappy dresser, and he could be very convincing as an interviewee. How much of that would you agree with? How much would you disagree with?
I mean, all of it is true. At a personal level, he was very amiable. He was never arrogant. He was very candid. He never held grudges. So all that is there. That's the track record. As I said, in his last, there was a dinner given for him just before he left Pakistan, and Jugnu and I were there. And I remember Jugnu saying things to him, and he heard it. He was still president at that time, and she was very critical. And she said, "You've done this. You've done this. You let us down. You've done." And he heard it all. His wife was there. His supporters were there. There was stunned silence, and he nodded. He said, "Yes, I accept. I've made a lot of mistakes." He was very humble, even right at the end. And so, yes, I think, but at the same time, he was a risk taker. Sometimes he held to his position unless persuaded to the contrary. And then he did some terrible things. I mean, the Benazir thing, the Akbar Bukti bit, all that could have been avoided. There was no need for all that, and it's a terrible thing to hang over his legacy.
Now, let me quote from the obituary published today by the British newspaper The Telegraph. I'm quoting the paper. He, i.e., Musharraf, enjoyed a glass of whisky, though he was careful never to be seen drinking it in public. Is that true?
That's true for a lot of Pakistani politicians and leaders and bureaucrats and journalists and others.
That, I would say personally, is what makes them likable at the end of the day. A little bit of hypocrisy shows that the man is a human being. Tell me, if you were to compare Musharraf with Pakistan's previous military dictators, would you say that he was more in the mold of a Ayub Khan than Zia-ul Haq?
He was certainly no Zia-ul Haq. Zia-ul Haq, nobody remembers with any fondness in this country. There's no sympathy for him. He's the architect of everything that went wrong in Pakistan after Zia took over. It's his legacies that we are still trying to combat. So there's no forgiveness for Zia. Musharraf was a man of many parts, many contradictions. There were likable things about him, and some terrible things that he ended up doing or being responsible for. So I think the debate about Musharraf will continue. It will not end. That final chapter still has to be written.
My final question, his body, I believe, is being brought back to Pakistan today. I'm told that the funeral will be in Karachi tomorrow. What is the public response to Musharraf's death?
Not much. The papers are obviously its front page news. There are editorials and obituaries. All of it point to the sort of issues that you and I have discussed. But there's no sadness, as it were, because this end was coming. In a sense, in the end, he became rather a pitiable person because he was confined to bed. And the great Musharraf, whose earlier pictures are of a commando with a pistol and much bravado, handsome. This is a man who'd aged and obviously been broken in many ways. He felt let down by General Kiani, I might add. He felt that General Kiani didn't do enough to support him or to bail him out, which may or may not be true. I think General Kiani had his own issues and problems. He probably wanted to take the army into a different route. But then General Rahil Sharif bailed him out, and subsequently the Army High Command, even today, has been very conscious of the fact that whatever he did, they have to protect their chief, because it's the chief, it's the institution that he represents that has to be protected. And so now he's been given not a state funeral, but he's been given a great funeral. And he's been airlifted in a special plane sent by the military and so on. So, yes, I think they would like to keep it like that.
It's absolutely true what you say when you say that towards the end he became pitiable. There's a harrowing picture on the BBC of General Musharraf in bed with an oxygen mask on his face, and he clearly looks incapable and dying. And yet, what I remember and will never forget is that image of him at Karachi airport, I believe, when he just landed from Sri Lanka, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, a pistol in his hand, which I think, if I remember correctly, he even fired into the air. That was the brave bravado of the commando. And you then end up with this rather sad and sorry image of the man lying in a hospital bed, probably unconscious.
Karan, that image is not from after he landed in Karachi. That image is from an earlier trip when he went to the mountains to brief Nawaz Sharif. That was taken in March of that year. A cigarette and a pistol in his hand, and the BBC made a big show of it.
Absolutely. I thank you, Najam Sethi, for talking to us and opening our eyes to the contradictions, but also the fascinating character of General Musharraf. He was a dictator, but he was not your run-of-the-mill tough man. There was another side to him, and today when he's died, it's important to remember the disturbing contradictions, but it's also important not to forget the delightful ones. And I thank you for reminding us of both.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.